A widow bought a forgotten 65-acre ranch. 1 year later, a wild stallion changed everything. She never saw him coming. Not the first time, not the second. By the third, she understood the horse had been watching her long before she ever noticed him standing at the tree line. And by then it was already too late to pretend the rest of her life hadn't quietly changed direction. Before this story begins, picture 65 acres of cracked Montana soil, a fence line collapsing under its own age, and one woman who bought all of it with the last money she had left in the world. Somewhere on that land is a wild stallion nobody could catch, a debt nobody warned her about, and a secret buried underwater that will change everything. If you have ever rebuilt your life from nothing, or watched someone else refuse to give up when everyone told them to, stay until the end. Like this video, subscribe if stories like this speak to you, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. The truck came up the gravel road just after 4 in the afternoon, trailing a thin curtain of dust that hung in the air long after the engine went quiet. Eileen sat behind the wheel for almost a full minute before she opened the door, looking at the house through the windshield the way a person looks at an old photograph they're not sure they recognize anymore. The ranch had been abandoned for 6 years before she bought it. The realtor called it a property with potential, which was the kind of phrase people used when they didn't want to say the roof leaked. The barn had a 15-degree lean, and the well hadn't been tested since the Clinton administration. 65 acres of high, dry Montana hill country, fenced unevenly, grown wild with sagebrush and old cottonwoods, sitting quiet under a sky that seemed too large for anyone to fill alone. Eileen was 58 years old. For 31 of those years, she had stood in front of a classroom teaching American history to teenagers who mostly wanted to be somewhere else, and for 29 of them, she had gone home each night to a man named Walt, who wanted, more than almost anything, a piece of land where he could watch the sun go down without a neighbor's porch light interrupting it. He used to draw the ranch on napkins, a house with a wraparound porch, a barn painted red instead of the tired gray most barns became, a pasture with a horse in it, because Walt had grown up poor and horseless and never stopped wanting one. He died 2 years before Eileen ever set foot on this land, a heart that gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was pouring coffee, fast enough that there was no goodbye, slow enough that she had time afterward to replay every year she'd said not yet, we'll do it after I retire, not yet. The mortgage isn't paid off, not yet. She sold the house in town 11 months after the funeral. She sold the car that still smelled like him. She sold jewelry she never wore and furniture she didn't need. And when the number in her account was finally large enough, she found this ranch listed for less than it should have cost, because no one else wanted 65 acres of trouble in the middle of nowhere. She wanted it precisely because no one else did. Her daughter called it grief dressed up as a life plan. Her sister called it reckless. Eileen called it nothing at all, because explaining it to people who hadn't stood where she was standing felt like a waste of the little energy she had left. The house itself had good bones and bad everything else. She spent her first months scrubbing, patching, replacing window glass with her own 2 hands, learning the particular ache of labor that has no one to admire it when it's done. The nights were the hardest. Montana silence is not like town silence. It has weight. It presses against the windows and makes a person listen to her own heartbeat as if checking that it's still keeping time. She told herself she'd get used to it. She told herself a great many things that first year, most of them meant to be encouraging, most of them landing somewhere closer to hollow. It was in her 4th month on the ranch that she first noticed the tracks. They cut along the northern fence line, deep and irregular, crossing from the neighboring public land onto her own property through a gap in a fence that had probably needed mending since before she arrived. Hoofprints, but wrong somehow, wider and rougher than anything shod. She mentioned it to the feed store owner in town, an older man with a face like cracked leather, and he told her, almost offhand, about a wild stallion that had been drifting through the high country for going on 3 years, unclaimed, unbranded, chased off 2 ranches already because he tore through fence lines like they were made of string. Nobody's caught him, the man said, setting a bag of oats on the counter. Nobody's going to. That one doesn't want catching. Eileen thought about that sentence the whole drive home. She thought about it again 3 days later, standing at her kitchen window at dawn, when she saw him for the first time. He stood at the far tree line, half swallowed in morning fog, a shape too still to be anything but deliberate. Even from that distance, The damage was visible in the way he held his weight, favoring his front legs, his gait uneven when he finally turned and vanished back into the timber. She stood at that window long after he was gone, coffee going cold in her hands, the kitchen behind her filled with a silence that, for the first time in months, didn't feel entirely empty. She didn't know yet that the animal she'd just watched disappear into the trees was already dying by inches, and that the next choice she made, small and quiet as it would seem to anyone watching, was about to become the only thing standing between her and losing everything Walt ever wanted for her. The apples came from a tree behind the barn that no one had pruned in a decade, gnarled and stubborn, still bearing fruit out of pure spite for the years of neglect. Eileen picked a bucketful on a Saturday morning for no reason she could name, and by instinct more than intention, she carried them to the fence line where the fog shape had stood 3 days earlier. She left 6 apples on a flat stone near the broken section of fence. She filled an old water trough that had been sitting dry and cracked since before she arrived, hauling buckets from the house by hand because the well line didn't reach that far out. Then she sat on an overturned crate a good 30 yards back, and she waited, because waiting, she was discovering, was something she had grown unexpectedly good at. Nothing came that day, nor the next. On the 3rd day, the apples were gone. The stone licked clean, the trough half emptied. She refilled it without looking for him, without calling out, without doing any of the things a person raised on movies about gentle cowboys and trusting animals might expect her to do. She simply left more apples, sat on her crate, and watched the tree line for the length of an afternoon that gave her nothing back but wind. This became the pattern of her days. Water, apples, the crate, the waiting. Her daughter, on their weekly phone call, asked what she'd been doing with herself out there, and Eileen said gardening. Because saying I've been sitting on a fence trying to earn the trust of a wild horse that may not even exist anymore felt like something that would end the conversation in a way she wasn't ready for. 3 weeks in, she saw him again. Not at the tree line this time, but closer, moving along the ridge above the pasture in the pale gray hour before full light, slow and deliberate. His weight still shifted wrong onto his hindquarters. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply let him see her seeing him, the way you might let a suspicious neighbor know you mean no harm by doing absolutely nothing at all. He came to the trough 2 days later while she sat on the crate, 30 yards out, hands still, breath even. He drank for a long time, longer than thirst alone should have required, and when he lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, he looked directly at her for the first time. Not the wary glance of a wild animal calculating an escape route. Something longer, something that held. Then he turned and was gone, and Eileen sat on her crate until the sun dropped behind the ridge, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. It took another 11 days before she saw his front legs up close enough to understand the truth of what she'd been watching. He came to the trough at dusk, careless with exhaustion or hunger or both, and in the fading light, she caught the swelling above both front hooves, the cracked and blackened texture of skin gone wrong, the particular way he set each foot down like the ground itself had turned against him. Rocky high country and standing water and infection had done what winters in Montana do to anything without a warm, dry place to heal. She understood, watching him limp away into the dark, that he wasn't simply wild. He was dying, slowly, on his own schedule, in a place where no one but her had ever bothered to look closely enough to notice. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind she used to grade essays on, and she wrote down everything she remembered from 30 years ago, when her father kept 2 horses on a rented pasture outside town, and she'd watched him treat a case of thrush that nearly cost one of them a hoof. She wrote down what she'd need: Epsom salt, iodine, clean wraps, a vet's number, though she doubted any vet in the county made house calls for a horse that belonged to no one and trusted nothing. By the time the sun came up, she had a plan built entirely on the assumption that a wild, wounded, unclaimed stallion might, eventually, allow a 58-year-old widow he'd known for less than a month to touch his legs without killing her for the attempt. It was, by any reasonable measure, an act of pure foolishness. She began that same afternoon, and what happened over the following 2 weeks would leave a mark on both of them that neither the winter nor the years afterward would ever fully erase. The first time she touched him, it was an accident of proximity more than intention. She'd been kneeling at the trough refilling it, focused on the bucket, when she felt the warmth of his breath against the back of her neck before she heard a single hoofbeat announcing his arrival. She did not startle. She would tell herself later that this was the moment everything shifted, though at the time it felt like nothing more than holding very still and hoping. He allowed her hand on his shoulder for 4 seconds before stepping back. The next day, 6. By the end of the first week, he stood while she ran her palm down the length of his foreleg, muscles coiled tight beneath the skin, ready to bolt at the smallest wrong movement, but not bolting. Treating the infection took discipline neither of them fully possessed. She soaked cloths in warm water and Epsom salt, pressed them to the swollen tissue above each hoof while he shifted his weight and blew hard through his nostrils, the closest thing to a complaint he allowed himself. She learned his patterns the way she'd once learned the rhythms of teenagers in her classroom, the tells that meant patience was running thin, the signs that meant it was safe to keep going. Twice he reared back hard enough that she stumbled away and sat in the dirt, heart slamming, and both times she got back up, dusted off her jeans, and returned to the work without a word, because some part of her understood that flinching now would undo 3 weeks of standing still. By the second week, the swelling had begun to recede. The color returned to healthier tissue. He still favored the legs, still walked with the memory of pain even after the pain itself had eased, but something in the way he carried himself had changed. He stopped watching the tree line as an escape route. He started watching the house. She named him without deciding to. Solstice came out of her mouth one evening while she worked iodine into a crack along his hoof wall, the sky behind him doing the particular deep orange thing it does at the far edge of a Montana summer. And once she'd said it aloud, there didn't seem to be any reason to call him anything else. What she hadn't expected, what nothing in her father's old stories or her legal pad notes had prepared her for, was what came after the healing. Solstice did not leave. He drifted the property in wide, looping patrols, appearing at the edge of the yard in the gray hours before dawn, standing sentinel near the barn while she worked, positioning himself. She began to notice, between the house and the tree line whenever a vehicle approached from the county road. The first time a stranger's truck pulled up the drive, a magazine salesman lost on his route, Solstice planted himself directly in the man's path with an expression that required no translation, and the truck reversed out without the driver ever stepping onto the property. She laughed the first time it happened, standing on the porch with a dish towel still in her hands, disbelieving in the particular way a person disbelieves something they are watching happen directly in front of them. She stopped laughing 3 nights later, when she woke to the sound of hooves circling the house at 2 in the morning, urgent and insistent, and stepped onto the porch to find Solstice staring hard toward the northern fence line where, in the moonlight, the shape of a coyote pack moved low and quiet along the property's edge. He stood between her and that fence line until the shapes dispersed into the dark. She began to understand, slowly, that whatever arrangement had formed between them over 3 weeks of apples and water and patient hands had become something neither of them had planned for and neither of them seemed inclined to walk away from. A wild, unclaimed, formerly dying horse had appointed himself the guardian of a widow's isolation, and the widow, for the first time in 2 years, no longer flinched at every sound the house made settling in the dark. It should have felt like enough. For a handful of weeks, it almost was. Then, on a Thursday morning in early autumn, a white pickup with a county seal on the door came up the gravel road, and the man who stepped out of it was not lost, was not selling magazines, and had no intention of leaving without something Eileen was not prepared to give. His name was Harvey Doss, and he had the kind of handshake that lasted a half-second too long, firm enough to communicate something without ever saying it aloud. He was the county's development committee chairman and, unofficially, the man most of the ranchers in the valley called when they needed a favor with a permit or a variance, which meant he was also the man most of them owed something to, whether they said so or not. He stood at the base of the porch steps with a manila folder tucked under one arm and a smile arranged with the precision of a man who had used it 1,000 times to soften bad news. Behind him, near the barn, Solstice had gone still, ears pinned forward, weight settled low and ready. Harvey didn't seem to notice the horse at all. That, more than anything else, told Eileen something about the kind of man she was dealing with. He talked for a while before he opened the folder. About the valley, about progress, about the gravel deposits under the northern ridge that geologists had flagged years ago, long before this land ever belonged to anyone Eileen had heard of. He talked about jobs, about the county's shrinking tax base, about how 65 acres sitting mostly idle wasn't doing anyone any favors, least of all a woman alone out here with no family close by to help her manage it. Then he opened the folder. The notice inside was old, technically speaking, filed against the ranch's previous owners years before Eileen ever made an offer, an environmental and water use violation tied to an unpermitted runoff channel someone had dug decades ago and never properly closed. It had sat in a filing cabinet gathering dust the way these things often do, until, Harvey explained, it had recently come to the committee's attention that the violation had never been formally resolved, and that as the current title holder, Eileen was now responsible for a fine substantial enough to make her stomach drop when he said the number aloud. 30 days. Pay it in full, or the county would be forced to consider more permanent remedies regarding the property's future use. Eileen read the document twice, standing on her own porch, the paper trembling slightly in a wind that had nothing to do with her hands. She asked why. If the violation had existed for years, no one had raised it before now. Harvey's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. Bureaucracy moves slow until it doesn't, he said, folding his hands. Sometimes it just takes someone paying attention. She didn't ask who had started paying attention, though she suspected she already knew, standing there with a stallion pinned and watchful 30 yards behind her and a folder in her hands that felt, suddenly, less like an accident of paperwork and more like the opening move in something calculated. Harvey left his card and a copy of the notice and drove off, without ever once acknowledging the animal that had tracked his every movement from the moment he stepped out of his truck. Eileen stood on the porch long after the dust from his tires had settled, the folder heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paper weight. That night, she called the county clerk's office, then a lawyer 2 towns over whose fee for a single consultation cost more than she wanted to think about, then her sister, who answered with the particular tone of someone bracing for bad news before Eileen said a word. The lawyer's assessment, when it came 2 days later, was not encouraging. The violation appeared to be real, buried, but legitimate, and while it likely wasn't Eileen's fault, ignorance of a prior owner's actions rarely functioned as a legal shield once title had transferred. Fighting it would take money and months she wasn't certain she had. Paying it would take nearly everything she had left. She sat with the folder open on her kitchen table for 3 straight nights, the number at the bottom of the page rearranging itself in her mind into everything it would cost her. Not just money. The barn Walt never saw finished. The porch he drew on napkins. The last physical proof that his wanting had ever mattered enough for her to build it, even 2 years too late. Solstice stood at the fence line each of those nights, unmoving, watching the house the way he had every night since the swelling in his legs had finally gone down. She began to wonder, sitting alone with the lamp burning low, whether Harvey's sudden interest had anything at all to do with an old drainage violation, or whether it had everything to do with what sat underneath 65 acres nobody had bothered to survey properly in years. She didn't yet have proof of that suspicion. She only had the particular, uneasy certainty that comes from watching a man smile at you while explaining exactly how much you're about to lose. The county records office was a squat brick building 2 towns over, the kind of place where fluorescent lights hummed loud enough to fill silences nobody wanted to fill with conversation. Eileen spent an entire Tuesday there, working through property files with a clerk named Denise who seemed, unlike most people Eileen had encountered since arriving in the valley, entirely uninterested in whose side she was supposed to be on. The paper trail took most of the day to untangle. The original violation had indeed been filed against the ranch's previous owners, a family named Kessler who'd walked away from the property 9 years earlier under circumstances the file didn't elaborate on. What the file also showed, buried 3 folders deep, was a geological survey request filed the previous spring, months before Eileen ever closed on the ranch, requesting mineral rights assessment on parcels, including her northern ridge. The name attached to that request was a shell company Eileen didn't recognize. The registered agent, when she cross-referenced it against a public business filings database on the library computer that evening, traced back through 2 more shell layers to an address she did recognize. Harvey Doss's real estate office, 4 blocks from where she now sat. It didn't prove intent. It didn't prove the drainage violation had been dug up specifically because Harvey wanted the mineral rights beneath her land badly enough to manufacture a reason to take it. But it painted a picture clear enough that the county clerk, when Eileen mentioned it carefully over the counter the next morning, went quiet in a way that told her more than any direct answer could have. "There's history with that office," Denise said, not looking up from her paperwork. More than one rancher's lost land to committee decisions that landed conveniently close to something Doss wanted. Eileen drove home that evening with the folder on the passenger seat and a new, colder understanding settling into her chest. This was never about an old drainage channel. It was about gravel and mineral rights, and a stallion who happened to guard land that someone had decided, long before she ever bought it, was worth more empty than occupied. Solstice met her at the gate the way he'd begun doing most evenings, pacing the fence line until her truck came into view. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment after cutting the engine, watching him watch her, and something in his stillness, the particular way he held his ground rather than retreating, reminded her of exactly how she'd felt the day she signed the papers on this ranch. Certain, stubborn, entirely unwilling to be moved by people who assumed she'd fold the moment things got difficult. She thought of Walt's napkin drawings folded in a drawer inside the house. She thought of 31 years spent teaching children about the people history remembered, the ones who stood their ground when standing was the hardest, least sensible option available. 30 days had become 26. The fine hadn't shrunk. The lawyer's fee estimate for a proper fight had grown larger the more he learned about who was on the other side of it. And somewhere on this land, buried under 65 acres of sagebrush and cracked earth, was something valuable enough that a man with a county seal on his truck door had been willing to dig up a decade-old paperwork error just to get his hands on it. She didn't know yet what that something was. She only knew, standing in her own driveway with a wild horse watching her with an intensity that felt less like coincidence and more like recognition, that she wasn't going to find out by giving up first. Word travels fast in a valley where everyone's related to someone who knows someone else's business. By the following week, Eileen could feel the shift in town before anyone said a word to her directly. The friendly nod from the hardware store owner arrived a half-second slower than it used to. The feed store clerk who'd once chatted with her about weather and horses now rang up her purchases with a tight, efficient politeness that left no room for conversation. She heard it plainly for the first time at the diner on Main Street, 2 booths over, a pair of ranchers not bothering to lower their voices as much as they should have. The gravel project would bring jobs. Real jobs, year-round, not the seasonal kind. Doss had been talking about it at the Grange Hall meetings for months, promising road improvements, promising a cut of county revenue that would finally fix the bridge on Route 9 that had been falling apart since before most of their children were born. And here was one woman, new to the valley, sitting on the exact 65 acres standing between the county and all of it, refusing to sell. Nobody said her name. They didn't need to. Harvey escalated with the patience of a man who understood that time itself was a pressure tactic. He appeared at the county commissioner's open session 2 weeks later, a meeting Eileen attended alone, sitting in the back row of a room that filled up faster than she expected, faces she half recognized from the grocery store and the post office, none of them meeting her eyes. He presented the gravel project with slides, job numbers, revenue projections, a map of the valley with her 65 acres shaded in a soft, reasonable blue, as though color alone could make the taking feel gentler. When the floor opened for public comment, 3 separate ranchers stood and spoke in careful, rehearsed language about progress and opportunity and the good of the whole county, and Eileen understood, listening to the practiced cadence of their words, that Harvey had spoken to each of them personally before this meeting ever convened. When it was her turn, she stood, and the room's attention settled onto her with a weight that made her hands go cold. She said she wasn't going to sell. She said the violation on her property was decades old, filed against people who no longer owned the land, and that she intended to fight it in whatever venue the county required. She said the word home once, and regretted it immediately, watching 2 commissioners exchange the kind of glance reserved for people they'd already decided were being unreasonable. Harvey thanked her for her comments with a warmth that felt, to Eileen, indistinguishable from contempt. The isolation deepened after that meeting in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. An invitation to a neighbor's harvest gathering, extended weeks earlier, quietly evaporated. The feed store, without ever saying so directly, began taking noticeably longer to fill her orders. An anonymous letter arrived in her mailbox and signed, suggesting she consider what was best for the community rather than her own stubbornness. She burned it in the wood stove without telling anyone, watching the paper curl and blacken, feeling something in her chest curl and blacken along with it. The nights grew harder to sit through alone. She found herself standing at the kitchen window more often than she used to, watching Solstice's shape move along the fence line in the dark, the one steady presence in a valley that had decided, almost unanimously, that her refusal to give up her husband's dream made her the obstacle standing between an entire community and the future it wanted. She was still deciding, on those long nights, whether stubbornness and conviction were the same thing, or whether she'd simply mistaken one for the other out of grief she hadn't fully processed. The lawyer's latest estimate for fighting the violation in court had climbed high enough that paying it would cost nearly as much as simply losing the land outright. 12 days remained on Harvey's original deadline, and somewhere in that valley, a decision was building itself around her whether she participated in shaping it or not. One evening, a truck she didn't recognize idled at the end of her drive for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away without ever approaching the house. She watched it from the kitchen window, lights off inside, the way a person watches something they can't yet name as a threat but already feels as one. Solstice noticed it first, standing rigid near the gate long before the sound of the engine reached her ears, and did not relax his stance until the taillights disappeared over the ridge. She mentioned the truck to no one. There was no proof it belonged to anyone connected to Harvey, no plate number she'd managed to catch in the dark, nothing but a feeling that had settled into her shoulders and refused to leave. She began locking the doors at night for the first time since moving in, a small, quiet surrender she resented even as she turned the bolt each evening. At the post office the following week, a woman she vaguely recognized from the harvest gathering she'd never been invited to stopped her in the parking lot, glancing twice over her shoulder before speaking. Eileen should be careful. Harvey didn't lose gracefully. There'd been a rancher 2 counties over who'd crossed him on a water rights dispute years back, a man who'd ended up selling out cheap after a string of unlucky seasons nobody quite believed were only bad luck. Then the woman was back in her car and gone before Eileen could ask anything further. Eileen drove home with both hands tied on the wheel, the warning sitting uneasily alongside everything else she was already carrying. She did not know, yet, whether it had been meant as kindness or as one more quiet pressure meant to convince her that folding was the only sensible option left. She only knew that the valley's silence around her had stopped feeling passive and had begun, in small and specific ways, to feel deliberate. Then, on a morning that started like every other morning that autumn, Solstice did something that changed the entire shape of what she thought she was fighting for. It began with the digging. Eileen noticed it first as a sound carried on the wind, a rhythmic, insistent striking she couldn't place until she followed it out past the barn to the low, marshy corner of the property she'd always avoided, a stretch of soft ground choked with reeds and rusted, half-buried fence wire that previous owners had apparently decided wasn't worth reclaiming. Solstice stood at the center of it, forelegs working the wet earth with a focus that had nothing accidental about it. He'd been at it long enough that a shallow crater had formed beneath him, dark water already pooling at its base. And when Eileen called out, he didn't so much as lift his head. He simply kept digging, methodical, deliberate, as though answering to an instinct that predated every fence and deed and county filing that had ever existed on this land. She stood at the edge of the marsh for the better part of an hour, watching him work, until the water pooling in the crater began to catch the light differently than rainwater should, clearer, almost blue at its edges, and steam began rising faintly off its surface into the cold morning air. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. When she finally did, she sat down hard on a fallen cottonwood log, because her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her upright. The water was warm, not sun-warmed, not the temperature of standing marsh water in autumn, but genuinely warm, rising from somewhere deep beneath the earth in a steady, patient current that had apparently been pressing against this exact spot for longer than anyone living had bothered to notice. A natural spring, and not an ordinary one. She called the state geological office the following morning with her hands still faintly trembling, expecting to be dismissed as a rancher exaggerating a puddle. Instead, a field geologist named Ruiz drove out 3 days later, took one look at the exposed spring, and spent the following 2 hours collecting samples with an intensity that told Eileen this was not, in fact, a small thing. The spring, Ruiz explained, sitting on the same fallen log Eileen had used days earlier, tapped into a geothermal vein running beneath the ridge, rare enough in this part of Montana that the state had exactly 2 other documented sites like it, both protected, both generating modest but steady tourism revenue for the counties lucky enough to have them. More than that, the marsh surrounding the spring, disturbed just enough by Solstice's digging to reveal it, hosted a cluster of wetland flora that Ruiz recognized immediately, plants on the federal endangered species list, dependent on exactly this kind of undisturbed thermal wetland habitat to survive. The gravel deposits Harvey wanted so badly sat directly uphill from all of it. Mining them would have meant runoff, sediment, chemical disruption flowing straight down into a spring and a habitat that federal law, once properly documented, would make untouchable. Eileen sat with that information for a long time after Ruiz packed up his samples and drove away, promising a full report within the week. She looked at Solstice, who had finally stopped digging and now stood at the marsh's edge, drinking from the very water he'd uncovered, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware in some way she had no language for, that he had just handed her something Harvey's slides and job projections could never out-argue. It should have felt like victory. It felt, instead, like the opening of a door onto a room she hadn't fully prepared herself to enter, because a discovery this significant would not stay quiet, and a man who had already shown he was willing to dig up decade-old paperwork to get what he wanted was not going to simply walk away because a horse had found something inconvenient buried in the mud. 12 days had become 9. And somewhere across the valley, Harvey Doss was about to hear, secondhand and furious, exactly what had been discovered on the land he'd spent months maneuvering to take. The offer came 2 days later, delivered not by Harvey himself, but by a lawyer in a gray suit who drove up the gravel road in a car too clean for the terrain and sat across from Eileen at her own kitchen table with a document already drafted, waiting only for her signature. The terms were, on paper, generous. Harvey's development group would purchase the northern half of the property, the ridge and the marsh both, at a price well above assessed value, more than enough to cover the drainage fine, the legal fees already accumulating, and leave a comfortable cushion besides. Eileen would retain the house, the barn, the southern 30 acres, free and clear, the violation dismissed as part of the settlement. The lawyer called it a fair resolution for everyone involved. He did not mention the spring by name. He did not need to. Eileen understood, reading between the document's careful language, that the geological report Ruiz had promised must have reached ears it wasn't intended for, and that Harvey's calculus had shifted overnight from wanting the gravel to wanting, more urgently, to control what happened to a federally protected discovery before it became public enough to stop him entirely. She sat with the document for 3 days before giving her answer, and those 3 days held more weight than almost any decision she'd made since Walt's funeral. Selling the northern half meant certainty. It meant the house stayed hers. The barn Walt never got to finish stayed standing, the last physical proof of everything he'd wanted preserved intact. It meant an end to the isolation in town, an end to the anonymous letters, an end to 9 days of counting down toward a deadline that had started to feel like a countdown toward losing everything at once. It meant, practically speaking, safety. It also meant handing over a natural spring and a protected habitat to a company whose only interest in it had ever been the value they could extract around its edges, trusting men who had already proven they'd bury inconvenient truths in filing cabinets for years if it served them. It meant Solstice's discovery, the one true thing he'd given her in return for weeks of apples and patient hands, would end up fenced off and regulated by people who saw it as an obstacle rather than a gift. She walked the property alone on the second night, the document still unsigned on her kitchen table, and found Solstice standing at the marsh's edge in the dark, steam rising faint and silver off the spring water around him. She stood beside him for a long time without speaking, without touching him, simply standing in the cold with an animal who had refused, months earlier, to let infection and exhaustion decide whether he lived or died on that rocky hillside. He hadn't compromised his way through that fight. He'd simply endured it, one painful step at a time, until the ground beneath him stopped fighting back. Inside the house, the drawer where she kept Walt's napkins sat half open, the way it had since she'd pulled them out weeks earlier to compare his sketches against the finished porch. She sat on the floor beside that drawer on the second night, papers spread around her in the lamplight, tracing the shaky pencil lines of a barn he never got to see stand upright. He had drawn a horse in the pasture on nearly every version, a rough, childish shape that looked nothing like Solstice and everything like the idea of him, sketched by a man who'd wanted, more than almost anything else in his life, somewhere quiet enough to finally slow down. She thought about the particular cruelty of an offer designed to look like mercy. Harvey's settlement would have let her keep the house, the barn, the porch, every visible proof that Walt's dream had been built at last. It would have cost her only the parts of the land no one could see from the kitchen window, the marsh, the ridge, the spring that had never appeared in any of his napkin drawings because neither of them had known it existed. A stranger looking at the settlement might have called it a fair trade, a woman keeping the memory intact while surrendering ground that had never meant anything to her marriage in the first place. But the spring hadn't belonged to Walt's dream. It belonged to Solstice's, if an animal could be said to have one, the exact stretch of earth he'd chosen to fight for with his own body when nothing else about this land had asked anything of him. Signing it away would have meant deciding that only the parts of a place tied to grief and memory were worth protecting, and that everything else, however alive, however real, could be traded off the moment it became inconvenient. She was no longer certain that was a distinction she was willing to make. Her sister called on the third morning, before Eileen had made her decision, and asked, not unkindly, whether this was really about the horse or about something Eileen hadn't finished grieving yet. Eileen didn't have a clean answer. She said only that she'd know what it was about once she'd made the choice, and that some things couldn't be sorted out in advance, no matter how much easier that would have made the whole ordeal. On the third morning, Eileen called the lawyer's office and told the assistant who answered that Mrs. Kessler-Doran, as the settlement paperwork had listed her, would not be signing. She told them she intended to fight the violation in full, keep every acre of the property she'd purchased, and take whatever came next. The assistant asked, carefully, if she understood what she was risking. She said she did. She said it clearly enough that there was no need to repeat herself, and hung up the phone in a kitchen that had never felt quite so silent, or quite so entirely her own. Harvey did not take the refusal quietly. Within a week, county inspectors arrived at the ranch unannounced, citing an anonymous complaint about an unregistered, potentially diseased animal running loose on private property, a risk, the paperwork claimed, to the health of livestock throughout the valley. 2 trucks, a livestock trailer, and a man from the state agricultural office carrying tranquilizer equipment pulled up the gravel drive on a gray, wind-scoured morning, and Eileen watched from the porch with her heart slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She argued. She produced veterinary notes she'd kept from the weeks of treating his hooves, proof of health, proof of temperament, proof that offered no legal protection at all for an animal that belonged, technically, to no one. The inspector, a tired man clearly following orders that had come down from somewhere above his own judgment, apologized with something that looked like genuine discomfort and explained that a directive was a directive, and that a wild stallion with no owner and no registration had no standing to refuse a county health assessment, whatever the circumstances of his care. They moved toward him with ropes and a tranquilizer rifle, and Solstice, who had stood calm through Harvey's first visit, calm through committee meetings and anonymous letters, and every slow indignity of the previous month, went rigid in a way Eileen had not seen since the earliest days of his healing. He did not run toward the tree line, the direction that would have carried him fastest and farthest from the men closing around him. He ran instead toward the marsh, toward the spring, hooves throwing up wet, dark earth, and stopped hard at its edge, turning to face the approaching men squarely, ears pinned, every line of his body drawn tight, with something that read less like fear and more like intention. Eileen ran after him, ignoring the inspector's shouted warning, and reached the marsh's edge just as the men caught up, tranquilizer rifle raised, ropes uncoiling. She stood between Solstice and the equipment with her hands open at her sides and told them, voice cracking but steady enough to carry, to look at what was in front of them before they did anything they couldn't undo. The steam rose soft and visible off the spring water in the cold morning air. The rare, low-growing plants Ruiz had photographed and cataloged spread in a dense, unmistakable ring around its edge, exactly where his report said they would be. One of the younger inspectors, a woman who had clearly done her homework before arriving, lowered her equipment first, staring at the marsh with an expression that shifted from procedural boredom into something closer to recognition. She asked, quietly, if this was the site from the State Geological Bulletin that had gone out to field offices 2 days earlier. It was. The tranquilizer rifle came down. The ropes stayed coiled. And the men who had arrived that morning under Harvey's directive to remove a supposed health risk found themselves instead standing at the edge of a federally significant discovery, made real and undeniable by the very animal they'd come to take away. The following weeks moved with the particular strangeness of a life reorganizing itself faster than a person can fully track. The State Agricultural Office withdrew its complaint the same afternoon. The incident report reclassified from health risk investigation to notation of ecological significance requiring further review. Ruiz's full geological survey went public within days, and the reaction it generated across 2 state agencies moved with a speed that Eileen, after months of watching bureaucracy crawl at its own convenience, found almost disorienting. The drainage violation that had started everything was, quietly and without fanfare, dismissed. A closer review of the original filing, conducted under considerably more scrutiny than the first time around, revealed the paperwork had never properly named the correct parcel to begin with, an error dating back to the Kesslers' ownership that no one, in the rush to pressure Eileen into a settlement, had bothered to verify. The county's own records office issued the correction. Denise, when Eileen thanked her over the phone, said only that some things had needed saying for a long time and left it at that. Harvey did not appear at the next commissioners' meeting. He resigned from the development committee 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons in a 2-line statement the local paper ran on page 4, and the shell company tied to his real estate office quietly dissolved its mineral rights filing before anyone could formally connect his name to it. Eileen never received an apology, and she stopped expecting one, understanding that some debts simply never get paid in the currency the wronged party actually wants. The spring and its surrounding wetland were designated for federal protection within 2 months, a process Ruiz told her would ordinarily have taken years without the ecological survey moving through channels as fast as public attention could carry it. The designation meant the land could never be mined, developed, or altered, meant it belonged, in the truest sense available under the law, to something larger than any single owner's claim on it. It also meant, quietly, and without anyone quite planning it, a small trickle of interest from people in nearby towns curious to see a genuine geothermal spring on protected Montana ranchland. Eileen found herself, some Saturdays, walking a handful of visitors out past the barn to the marsh's edge, answering questions about temperature and mineral content and the particular plants growing in the ring around the water, discovering in herself a version of the classroom voice she'd assumed had gone quiet the day she retired. Solstice tolerated the visitors with a wary patience that never quite became warmth, keeping his distance, watching from the tree line the way he'd once watched her from it. But each evening, once the last car had pulled away down the gravel road, he returned to the fenced line near the house and stood there, steady and unbothered, the way he had every night since the infection in his legs had finally healed. Eileen stood on her porch one evening in late October. The barn behind her finally repainted the red Walt had drawn on his napkins decades earlier, and watched the horse she had almost lost twice, once to infection and once to a rifle, standing sentinel over land that had almost been taken from her twice as well. She did not think of it as a happy ending. It didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like the exact middle of something that was still, every day, asking something of her. But the town's silence had begun, slowly, to soften. A neighbor waved from her truck window the following week for the first time in 2 months. The feed store owner asked, almost shyly, if the spring water really was warm enough to swim in during winter. Small things. Not forgiveness, not quite friendship restored, but the beginning of a valley recalculating what it thought it knew about the stubborn widow on the 65 acres nobody else had wanted. It came in early November, quieter than anything before it, which was somehow worse. A letter arrived from a private mineral rights firm out of Billings, unconnected on paper to Harvey or his old shell company. expressing renewed interest in the ridge adjacent to the newly protected wetland, citing a loophole in the federal designation's boundary survey that left roughly 4 acres of gravel-rich slope technically outside the protected zone. Eileen read the letter twice at her kitchen table, the same table where Harvey's settlement offer had once sat waiting for a signature, and felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite exhaustion, but some tired, familiar cousin of both. She called Ruiz that evening, who confirmed, with visible reluctance, that boundary surveys on rushed federal designations sometimes did leave small gaps that companies with enough patience and enough lawyers occasionally found ways to exploit. She thought, sitting alone with the letter under lamplight, that perhaps this was simply how it would always be now. One threat resolved, replaced by another, the valley's appetite for what sat beneath her land apparently inexhaustible. She walked out to the marsh that night instead of answering the letter, and found Solstice standing at its edge exactly where he always stood, steam rising soft around his legs in the cold air. She stood beside him for a long while, watching the water catch what little moonlight made it through the clouds, and understood, finally, without needing anyone to explain it to her, that the fight over this land was never going to end in a single clean victory. It would simply keep asking to be fought, in smaller and smaller pieces, for as long as she chose to stay. She chose to stay. The next morning, she called the state office overseeing the wetland designation, provided the mineral rights letter as evidence, and formally requested an emergency boundary review, citing the same ecological survey that had protected the rest of the land in the first place. The 4 acres in question, it turned out, sat directly upslope from the spring's primary aquifer feed, close enough that any drilling would almost certainly compromise the water table below. The review took 6 weeks instead of 6 months, and closed the loophole for good. The mineral rights firm withdrew its interest without ever sending a second letter. Winter came hard and early that year, the kind of Montana cold that turns breath to visible cloud and makes every chore outside a small negotiation with the wind. Eileen kept the barn heated enough for Solstice to shelter in on the worst nights, though he rarely used it fully, preferring the open sky even when snow gathered thick along his back, standing his watch regardless of temperature. She thought, some evenings, about the version of herself who had driven up this gravel road 2 years earlier with a truck full of boxes and no real plan beyond needing somewhere to put down the weight of 31 years of teaching and 29 years of loving a man who never quite got to see this land the way he'd imagined it. That woman had believed, without quite admitting it to herself, that buying the ranch was the last significant thing she would ever do. A monument built to a marriage rather than the beginning of anything new. She understood now, watching Solstice's breath cloud in the cold air outside her kitchen window, that she had been wrong about that, in the particular way it feels good to be wrong. The barn stood finished, red and solid against the snow. The porch held the exact shape Walt had drawn on a napkin decades before either of them had ever set foot on this land. And 65 acres, every single one of them, remained hers, protected now not by luck or by paperwork alone, but by the slow, patient work of a woman who had refused, at every point where refusing cost her something real, to let anyone convince her that giving up was the reasonable choice. She had lost things along the way that would not come back. The easy friendliness of a town that had, for a season, decided she was the obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. Money that might have built a more comfortable life if she'd simply signed Harvey's settlement the first time it was offered. Some version of the peaceful, uneventful retirement she might have imagined for herself, replaced instead by a life that kept asking her to fight for it. What she'd gained didn't erase any of that. It simply sat alongside it, the way most true things in a life eventually do. On the anniversary of Walt's death, she walked out to the marsh in the late afternoon light, snow crunching under her boots, and stood at the spring's edge where steam still rose soft against the cold. Solstice came to stand beside her without being called, the way he had for over a year now, his breath and hers mingling faintly visible in the freezing air. She didn't speak to him the way people speak to horses in movies, didn't offer some tearful, tidy monologue about grief and healing and everything finally making sense. She simply stood there, in the particular quiet of a place she had almost lost twice, next to an animal who had once been dying on a rocky hillside with no one paying attention, and let the moment be exactly as complicated and unfinished as it actually was. The land had not made her whole. Nothing, she understood now, was ever going to do that cleanly or completely. But it had given her back something she hadn't realized she'd lost entirely. Somewhere between the funeral and the empty house in town and the long, silent nights that followed, it had given her back the sense that she still belonged somewhere, to something, in a world that had spent 2 years treating her like a woman whose story had already ended. Eileen still lives on that ranch. The spring draws a slow, steady trickle of visitors each summer, careful and respectful of the boundaries the state now enforces around it. The barn is red. The porch holds 2 chairs instead of 1, because her daughter visits more often now, and because some evenings, sitting alone simply feels different than it used to. Solstice never became a horse anyone could claim to fully own, and Eileen never tried. He comes and goes along the fence line on a schedule that belongs entirely to him, disappearing for days into the high country before returning, unannounced, to stand watch over a house and a woman who once decided, on a quiet morning with a bucket of apples and nothing but time, that some things are worth showing up for even when nothing promises they'll show up back. Not every ending is a resolution. Some are simply the place where the fighting becomes, at last, a little quieter. Thank you for staying with Eileen and Solstice until the very end. If this story moved you, if you've ever rebuilt something out of almost nothing or trusted someone the world had already given up on, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that starting over is never too late. And if you want more stories like this one, true to life, slow, and honest about what it costs to hold on to what matters, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.